Chapter 4. Afternoon shadows lay long and blue as the two weary slouching horsemen threaded the lonely pine canyons a dozen miles west of the wild Cambrilla Range. One sat his saddle tall and broad-shouldered, while the other, stout and stocky in a butternut shirt and faded, bulging bib overalls, rode with his stubby legs outthrust at what seemed a most uncomfortable angle. They were Ezra and Sam alone, the latter indulging in Montuous and Aquarius monologue.
"Danged if I don't know why I even teamed up with you. It's a blazed wonder we even managed to scrape together a decent living, let alone get ahead. Here we sell a sizable herd of prime horses and drive 'em close to 100 miles, with me doing most of the work, but you get to carry the money. Need it for all that shady poker debt, like as not. And next time, when we settle up our grocery bill, it'll be coming out of my pocket."
Ezra turned to examine Sam's moody face. "It's a question whether I can get you to the next town and pour a drink or two into you, the shape you're in," he muttered doubtfully to himself. I was afraid that this here trip was too hard, at your advanced age, that is." Animation sparked in Sam's lackluster eyes. He fired up at this too thinly disguised form of sarcasm.
"Go take a run and jump at yourself," he roared. "I'm a right smart handsome foal younger than you are. 10 anyways, you superannuate hat rack."
My, Ezra said admiringly. "Wasting such high-class language on me. You must have spent a good 10 years longer in kindergarten, too." Sam scoffed.
"I knowed more'n you the day I was born."
He broke off, his voice returned to normal, with a startled abruptness for anyone who didn't know these two.
"How much further is it to Ute Gap, anyway?"
Ezra squinted unhurriedly at the various landmarks looming around the amber afternoon light. 5 mile? Maybe a bit less," he grunted. Sloane lifted his reins.
"Let's set these bone racks a-clattering. I want to get home before winter."
As the little man said, the pair had just sold a herd of roan horses at an advantageous price and had found it worthwhile to make delivery in person. On the previous day, they had reached the isolated mountain ranch to which the animals were consigned. A considerable amount of money had changed hands, which Ezra had promptly appropriated and stowed away, and after spending the night at the ranch, they were on their way back to Powder Valley. Mending their pace in the prospect of a pleasant evening at the high country cow town, they forged on. Ute Gap was little more than a wide place in the road, consisting of perhaps a score of odd buildings. Reaching the place just as the sun was setting, they looked over the weathered collection of saloons and general stores and blacksmith shops and sagging sheds from the end of the street.
"I hope there's a place to eat in this roaring metropolis,"
Sam commented as they turned their mounts towards the nearest hitching rack. Having dismounted, Ezra paused in the act of fastening his reins and turned abruptly. "Hey, Runt, take a look at this." His thumb stabbed at the saddle horse standing next alongside the partly filled rack. Sam craned to look. His prominent black eyes bugged out.
"What is that brand? Is that the Star Cross?"
His heart sank a full octave.
"You mean young Morgan's here in town? So what? We don't know him nothing."
Ezra shrugged. "Well, just so long as he don't get the idea that we're trailing him around."
"Well, if he does, he can get over it."
Oh. Sam broke off suddenly that Ezra turned to look at him. Over the back of his horse, Sam was peering down Ute Gap's single street, and his attention was riveted upon something.
"That ain't Ray Morgan by a long shot," he muttered positively.
As he glanced that way, Ezra's gaunt face grew sober. He saw the man walking across the street, 100 yards below, his arm done up in a bandage handkerchief sling. His own tone was guarded. What would Pike Taggart be doing here? He scratched his lean jaw thoughtfully. By gravy, Sam, we've stumbled upon something that looks kind of strange. For once, Sloane was all in thoroughly accord. We're letting it pass? He inquired. Or should we look into it? At another time, Ezra would have brushed the matter aside with scant ceremony, but Pat Stevens' obtuse course of action, where Morgan was concerned, had kind of piqued him. Why pass it up? He grunted. He waited till the gnarled flag foreman had gone from sight and then spoke with energy. Come on. We're dragging our broncs out of here before them hombres so much as we get a smell of 'em. Although he knew his hopes of a satisfactory supper and expansive evening had gone glimmering, Sloane did not demur. He took time to slip into an adjacent store for a sack of crackers and a half-pound of cheese, and he and Ezra quietly retired to the cover of the pines. Darkness soon fell. Stealing into Ute Gap on foot, the two were not long in discovering the men they sought. Oddly enough, though the grizzled partners did not find it strange, Taggart and young Morgan were together. Seated at a saloon table in a dusty corner, they appeared to be in conference. It was not possible to overhear what they were saying, nor could the watchers devise any means of accomplishing this, but the interference to be drawn from a mere glimpse of the two together seemed more than sufficient.
Kind of seemed to get over their differences pretty quick, didn't they?
Growled Sam, when they backed away from the window through which they were peeping into the enveloping darkness. If they had any, Ezra rejoined dourly. From here, it looks as if that fist fight they pulled was a put-up job. Wouldn't old Stevens be interested in this?
Oh, he'll hear of it all right,
Sam promised. They canvassed the idea of delaying to see more. It would have been a pleasure to both shove a undisputed proof of a deep-dyed chicanery under Pat's nose, for their distrust of Ray Morgan was instinctive and strong. On the other hand, Ezra thought that with haste, Stevens might be able to enable to witness personally some sort of the crookedness which they had little doubt was afoot. After making their best of their way back to their horses, they carefully circled Ute Gap and struck out for the lonely trail over their umbrellas. An early moon soon declined, darkness hampering their progress. At last they hauled up from the night, having reached the western slopes of the mountains. Having crossed Aspen Pass and the high Cumbrellas by mid-morning, they abandoned the circuitous downward wagon road for a more direct course towards Stevens' Lazy Mare's Spread. Working down through the foothills, they passed China Springs at no great distance. Ezra glanced that way more than once, his single eye slitting shrewdly. He finally spoke. Thought Stevens wasn't using his China Springs range this season.
He ain't.
Sam drew rein long enough to peer down there through the intervening pines. My good, what? There's stock grazing down there. I wonder. Both recalled how the rustled Lazy Mare steers had been watered at this same remote spot. With a wordless exchange of glances, they turned their horses that way. Their approach was cautious, for it did not escape either that rustlers might now be laying in wait. Closing in on the isolated spring, however, they neither saw nor heard anyone about. At the same time, a surprise of another order awaited them. Hello! Moving out into the open, Sam stared at the nearest steers, his normally placid face knotted with wrath.
Damned if Morgan's star-crossed stuff ain't moved in here. Look at that, Ez.
There could be no mistake. Every steer in sight bore the distinctive star-crossed brand which had arrested their attention upon that horse back in Utah Gap. Ezra's hard-breathing snort covered a wide range of expression. "That does it," he growled. "Shall we get on to Pat's and dump this in his lap?" Not often were the pair called on to cover ground with greater speed than they exhibited in making for the headquarters of the Lazy Mare. Crusty Hodge was waiting for them on the porch, shading his old eyes with a wrinkled hand. He watched their hasty approach without visible emotion, and they knew him better than to expect a greeting.
"Stevens around?"
Sam tossed out briskly, hauling up near the porch with a scatter of gravel. Crusty grunted a negative and then continued studying them with some curiosity. Not for anything would he have asked a question, as a consequence of making the best of what observation would tell him. They dismounted, thrust him aside bodily as they slumped into the kitchen. "Okay, slap on some hot grub on the table and make her fast," Ezra bellowed and scowled at Hodge. "What you waiting for?" Knowing full well that his employer would acquiesce, Crusty reluctantly complied, as in no hurry to accommodate them, though. Nor would he answer any satisfactory of their gadfly queries, considering where Stephen's movements were today. Pat was somewhere about the ranch. That was about all they could get out of him.
"Well, I guess we'll just have to wait for him," Sam sighed. "I sure hope he don't ride in late."
Pat's return was in fact early for him. Jogging into the yard an hour before sundown, he grinned at the two dough-faced old rawhides that were perched on the porch steps. "Well, the healthy-looking pair of old helligans you make," he commented inelegantly.
"Well, don't be putting that bronc away," Sloane sang out a warning. "You'll be needing it."
Pat tossed his reins to the ground and slid off the hull and walked forward. He examined their faces with interest almost equal to Krusty's. "What are you two doing here? I thought you was away delivering some horses," he asked easily.
"Well, they've been delivered."
Sam lost no time in recounting what they had witnessed at Ute Gap on their way home.
"And that ain't all, Stevens," he wound up. "Right now there's about 100 head of star-crossed steers grazing as big as life on your China Springs range."
Pat's mobile lips folded shut, and he looked at Sloane slowly. "You don't say. I guess there can't be no mistake about that, I don't suppose."
"Mistake?"
Sam flushed with indignation.
"Hell, we seen 'em ourselves."
Without more words, Pat turned to Crusty Hodge, watching them from the kitchen door. "Shove the grub on the back of the stove, Crusty," he instructed. "We'll be having us a late supper." Taking the hint, Sloane and his gangly companion lost no time in reaching their own horses. The trio single-footed out of the yard, and once out into the open range, shoved their mounts to a brisk pace. Pat put a few brief inquiries as they made for China Springs, but for the most part he rode silent and thoughtful. "I don't get it," he spoke up at last, shaking his head. "Star-crossed stuff grazing on my range, and you say young Morgan's way up across the mountains in Ute Gap, where he was."
"You'll get it all right once you take a gander your own self," Sam retorted. "I know you ain't been able to see what's going right on under your nose, but maybe from here on out you'll find it worth your own while taking a look behind you."
They batted it back and forth without getting anywhere, and then, drawing near China Springs at last, fell silent and watchful once more. Pat was the first to open his lips, gazing down a long, bushy slope toward the lush meadow that surrounded the springs. "I don't see any cows down there at all," he grunted, as if all along he was expecting no other result of their ride. Sloane's jaw dropped as he stared about suspiciously. It was a fact that no sign remained now of the steers that he and Ezra had seen just a matter of hours before.
Well, that's dang queer, he growled defensively. The stuff certainly was here.
As they jogged down the slope and drew near the springs, Ezra attentively scanned the looming lava ledges that rose frowning beyond the little meadow. Suddenly, he held up a hand. "Listen." Faint sounds were indeed drifting from the direction of those ragged rocks. It was as if a considerable bunch of steers had been herded that way. Sam caught fire in a flash, and slapping his fleshy thigh.
"Uh-huh," he exclaimed. "There you are, Stevens. 15 minutes later, and we'd been too late."
Lifting their broncs into a run, they swept across the meadow and circled the ledges. The rough going here presently forced them to slacken pace, but the sound of cattle drive was unmistakable. A muffled cowboy yell pealed in the bawl of a steer. 5 minutes later, in the fading light, they caught sight of the drive winding slowly across the broken malpas. One man was behind it, and as they closed in, Pat, at least, was not greatly astonished to learn that it was Ray Morgan himself. "What's up, Morgan?" Pat waved a nonchalant hand as the busy redhead suddenly turned his head to flash a look backwards. Ray swiveled his bronc to face him squarely, holding himself tense and watching silently.
"You want something, Stevens?"
he said at last. Pat was not inclined to be easy with him in the face of this uncompromising demeanor. "A civil word will do," he returned dryly. "You'll grant my surprise to find you driving stock at this hour. Don't you never quit?" Morgan manifestly did not know how to receive this brand of chivalry.
"When your stock strays, you drive it home. Or at least I do," he added.
Pat displayed mock astonishment. "You mean your whole herd strayed in one direction?" Even in this dim light, Morgan's flush was noticeable.
"I never drove my stuff down onto your range, Stevens," he protested earnestly. "You can believe it or not, just as you like."
"All right, Morgan, I'll buy it," Pat nodded. "As a matter of curiosity, though, how do you suppose they got there?" Ray explored his serene features uncertainly. He shook his head at last with a dogged expression.
"I don't know. There's fine grays down there and good water."
"So you think maybe that just enticed them, do you?" Listening to this sparring exchange with dark, incredulous mien, at this point Sam turned to regard Ezra in scornful disgust. The lanky one returned his look with a shrug. Obviously neither of the pair placed any credence in a single word that the young rancher had to offer. Observing them out of the corner of his eye, Pat spoke with some sharpness. "All right, you two. It's no snap getting the herd across these rocks with night coming on. Perhaps we should pitch in and get Morgan shoved along on his way." They stared at him unbelievingly, but Pat soon disillusioned them in his sincerity and turned to the work briskly himself. With great reluctance they followed suit, and it could only be said of them that at least they did their work well. It was not yet dark by the time the treacherous Malpas had put the star-crossed beeves, and Morgan knew that the worst of his troubles were over.
"Well, you're a queer one, Stevens," he blurted out finally, new energy in his tone. "You had no call to be lending me a hand, but this time I'm thanking you, and what more, I mean it. I know I'm plumb stubborn, I guess, but I hope I ain't altogether a fool."
"Nor a knave either, Morgan, or you wouldn't have been in such a hurry to push your stock back off another man's range," Pat seconded in a smiling agreement.
"Not that kind of range, anyway," Morgan confessed in a warmer tone than he had ever used before.
Pat glanced at him curiously. You're thinking about winter range, I expect. His pause was deliberate. If you really need it, why don't you lease China Springs, Morgan, and be done with it? Morgan shot him a quick look, and then away. Well, now, if only I could. It's a matter of ready cash, eh? Pat chuckled. I know what it's like to get started my own self. Maybe we could make us a deal, he suggested blandly. Or perhaps that wouldn't appeal to you? Invincible weariness touched Morgan's stern young face again. Offhand it don't. What is it I've got to offer you, Stevens, that you'd want? Well, you can work, can't you? Pat asked reasonably. It happens that I'm a little short-handed right now. Help me comb my lazy mare stuff down into the breaks this fall, and your winter range it'll be all paid for. Morgan hung on to the words hopefully, yet still he delayed. How long will that take, Stevens? Pat shrugged. Oh, maybe a matter of a week or 10 days, I'd say. I won't aim to ask for blood in exchange for a little grass, if that's what you mean. His disclaimer of sharp dealings was a shade elaborate, but he need not have bothered. A load seemed to have slipped off Morgan's capable back, and he sat straighter, and his freckled, dusted face brightened. What's the deal? He said. I'm beginning to believe you're not against me, Stevens. I can't explain what I mean, but I'll take you up, and I'll be sure to return good measure into the bargain. You won't be sorry for it. End of chapter 4.